episode 86 of School Librarians United. I am your host, Amy Herman. This podcast is dedicated to the issues and challenges school librarians face every day. As a school librarian starting my 14th year, I found myself asking the question, where is the podcast that will help me do my job? I wanted a podcast which addressed the nuts and bolts of running a successful library program. I don't claim to have the answers, but I hope that this is a platform to share resources and exchange ideas. Now is a perfect time to mention that all the ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast by myself, by my interview guests, and by listeners who contact podcast are our own and do not reflect those of our school districts. When incorporating research, I always make sure to cite my sources. So whether you are a novice or a veteran school librarian, this podcast is something for you. I'd like to extend a very special welcome this week to listeners Victoria in Florida, Lisa in Michigan, Leslie and Nancy Jo in Texas. I asked Angela in Illinois if I could share what she mentioned to me on Facebook Messenger. Angela was tuning in to the virtual focused episodes, which we've recorded recently, and she wrote, quote, "Truly, one of my professional goals is to make everyone smile and laugh a little," end quote. I love it. I think that's a great way to go moving forward with my lesson plans that I have with my students starting in a few weeks. So thank you very much for Angela for reminding me of what matters. I welcome you and all listeners to reach out with your feedback, your questions, and episode suggestions, and maybe a couple volunteers or two to be on a future episode, either on Facebook, Twitter, or the email address schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. If you include your mailing address, I will be sure to send you a podcast sticker. And that holds true for our international listeners as well, because I have these fantastic stamps that I love to use and I don't get to very often. So please know that I'm happy to send these letters and podcast stickers out to you wherever you happen to live. Although please be aware that the Postal Service in the United States has been a little wonky these days. And now, for today's episode, virtual book clubs, per your request, and my interview with Kitty Felde. Excited to be sharing a conversation today. I've got to tell you, I am just a little starstruck right now. And that is because I am an incredible fan of the guest we are bringing on the show today. Kitty Felde is a podcast host, and I'll be honest, I look up to her because she's been in the business longer than I have, and I just am so impressed. So I'm so glad that she's on the show today. Kitty, normally I begin my conversations by asking guests to describe their library and the grades they teach and the programming they offer. And your expertise and the resources you're going to share with us come from a very different place. I've been a listener of yours for years. Would you please tell everyone about the podcast that you created, the Book Club for Kids?
Oh, thank you for Amy. Thank you so much for having me on the show, number one. I mean, I'm a major fan of yours, mostly because I don't come from a library background, and I feel like I have learned so much about the world you guys work in every day. So thank you for that. Okay, so Book Club for Kids. It actually started a million years ago when I had a talk show on a public radio station here in Southern California, KPCC. And we would go out to the LA Times Festival of Books every year, and they would have a booth and for my station, and people would come up to you and say, "Oh, I love your show," and you'd say, "Thank you." And they'd have their kid with them, and the kid would say, "Yeah, I listened to your show too." And I said, why are you listening? There is nothing of interest that we're talking about. We're talking politics, we're talking healthcare, anything like that. And the kid goes, "Yeah, I know." And I said, "Well, then why are you listening?" And they said, "Because I'm stuck in mom's carpool." And I thought, oh my God, I have a captive audience. So I said, well, okay, so let's say we did something on the show just for you. What would you be interested in? And because we were at a book festival, they said books. So once a month, what I did was throw the adults out of the studio and invite middle grade kids in to talk about a novel. And we would have the author listening in on the phone, and we would have a celebrity because we were, an LA radio station and everybody was promoting a movie. So celebrities would go through the movies. So they'd be coming through the station. I'd grab them and say, listen, would you read a page from this book? And then we'd mix it all together. And that was our show once a month that we did. And management went crazy because they're going, well, why are we doing this? What's the purpose? And I said, we're creating public radio listeners for the future. And then they said, oh, yeah, but baby boomers are going to live forever. So we moved the show eventually to cable TV here in Los Angeles. And then I got sent as a reporter to open up a Washington bureau to cover Capitol Hill. And it was too wacky time-wise for me to continue doing it. So I did nothing. When I stopped reporting, I said to myself, well, what do I want to do? Do I want to do more freelance reporting? Do I want to write a book? What do I want to do? Be an actor? And I thought, no, I really enjoyed, the thing I enjoyed most about journalism, quite frankly, was sitting in that studio and talking to kids about books. And that, because the technology had changed, this was 2015, I had all the equipment and I knew how to do this. I started the Book Club for Kids podcast when I was living in Washington, D.C. And it's pretty much the same format. I would go into a classroom or a library or a bookstore or a book festival. We'd have usually 3 kids. They would pick a book, or their teacher or librarian would pick a book. We would talk about the novel. And then they would ask questions of the author, who generally wasn't in the room. I would find the author, pose the questions. We'd paste it all together. We'd get a celebrity to read. We've had everybody from an FBI agent and the former Secretary of Education, John King, and Adam Schiff, and, actually 2 of the vice presidential possibilities were celebrity readers for us, too. So we've had a really interesting variety of, and public radio people. Susan Stamberg was a celebrity reader. So all of those mixed together, we started then and we continue today, sort of virtually. Interesting, going into this new frontier where we find ourselves.
It's really been great for me to listen to your podcast because you've put it together in such a way. There are the kids, you've got the celebrity reader, you've got the author interview, and it is a kid length. I mean, you're dealing with episodes that are very digestible for kids. And if this, this will come out later in our conversation, but friends, we're talking about a resource that kids use. We're talking about a resource that educators use and school librarians use. So we're going to sort of take this apart and talk about how the kids use it and how teachers and librarians can use it. So I'm so excited because Kitty Felde has been hosting a virtual book club for more than 5 years. So I really couldn't think of somebody more relevant for this conversation. Kitty, we've been virtual since this spring, and the number of your listeners has only been increasing, and that has to be validating when COVID started.
Yeah, I won't say it's a surprise, but I guess the numbers really did surprise me. I knew that people were looking for learning resources. I knew that from teachers I knew that from, just everywhere. And I kept thinking, well, what we have, how can we get it out there? Who wants what we have? And it was, school librarians, it was teachers, et cetera, et cetera. And our downloads jumped 200%. I looked at what people were looking for on the website, and curriculum or study guides were really important. We put those up. We have had, as Black Lives Matter became the focal point and people were looking for books, we have a very wonderful collection of conversations about books with either African-American themes or African-American authors. And so we collected those. I mean, there's a lot. I kept looking for things. How can I put what I have into the hands of teachers looking for resources? And we continue to try to find ways to do that.
Well, and we're going to go through a lot of what you offer, and friends, the curriculum guides are fantastic, and you also don't charge what Teacher Pay Teacher does. So I got to tell you,
no, we're free.
Librarians are looking for our OERs, our open educational resources, and ones we don't have to pay for. You also offer newsletters. And I think this is fantastic. I mean, how would when it comes to your newsletters, tell us, because without the benefit of looking at one of your newsletters, if somebody signed up for your newsletters, how often would they arrive, and what kind of information would they provide?
Okay, so we do a every other week newsletter. During the early days of COVID, we increased to once a week. But even for me, that was, if I were getting newsletters once a week, I think I'd throw them out the window or put them in trash right away. So every other week is when we do it. And ostensibly, the purpose is to offer one reading tip, mostly for kids who would not normally pick up a book and stick their nose in it. And I've been getting suggestions from teachers, from librarians, from professionals in the field. I got one from a U.S. congressman who was a former English teacher, and he talked about how he used to read Pride and Prejudice aloud to his high school English class, and they were hooked. These are older kids, but they just were hooked. So that's what we send out. We send that out. We send out any announcements of things that are coming up, always an invitation to people to, send us a reading tip, how you can get your kids on the show, and any press mentions that we have, because we've been getting some of those, New York Times and School Library Journal and things like that. So all of those things we include in the newsletter. It's not an encyclopedia. It's short, it's conversational, and I hope it's helpful.
Well, and I got to tell you, we're going to talk more about your website in a minute, but it is truly a resource for those of us who work with middle grade and work with students, and for so many reasons. And friends, I'll include a link in the show notes. Yeah, anytime the New York Times talks about you, that's when you hit the big time.
Oh, I felt like I did. I really did.
You're real. The New York Times wrote about you.
And living here in California, I just have to say this, because there's such an East Coast bias in the way the world is presented. And for somebody in California to finally get recognized by the New York Times, it really does. It's like, oh yeah, fine. I'm with the big boys now.
Yeah, well, friends, Kitty really sort of downplayed her professional background, but when you are on public radio and you are professionally trained, I had a few concerns because I didn't want my listeners to realize just what an amateur they're dealing with here when they hear me broadcast each week. So, friends, Kitty, I know you and I share a very strong belief in the power of podcasting. Listener Sarah, one of my listeners from North Carolina, reached out specifically, and she asked for an episode on running virtual book clubs. And I mentioned it on the next episode because that's what I do. I put out a request, and like the next day, you wrote me. I'm embarrassed. I was like, I didn't think to reach out to you because I thought you would have been too busy running your own podcast. But, I want to hear more about this, where you came from when it comes to your interest in podcasting as a platform, because not everybody gravitates to it the same way that you and I have.
Oh, I just think that the power of listening is incredible. I mean, I don't have great eyesight. I really wanted to be a play-by-play announcer. That's how I got into radio. The Dodgers were having this contest looking for a female voice for their sports talk show because they had no female listeners. It was pretty lame. But, 2,000 people applied, and guys applied because it was discriminatory. So they opened it up to the guys. And I didn't win, but I was one of the 10 finalists. And so I thought, I could go into radio. So that's kind of how I got into radio. But I wanted to be a play-by-play announcer. But I have really lousy vision. I have really lousy depth perception. So every fly ball looked like a home run to me. So it wasn't exactly a profession I could make a living at. But people would tell me things. People talk to me, and they always have. And this audition, it was the wife of the Dodger catcher who decided to tell me things you never would tell a journalist. I had no journalism background, but I knew that she shouldn't be telling me those things about, life is the wife of a big league catcher. So, and that's always sort of been my one strength, is that people will talk to me. They trust me, politicians, and especially kids. Because I can remember talking to kids. I can remember being 12 years old and, adults talk to you like, so how's school? And that's about all they know how to ask you. They don't have anything else to ask you. And they do it in a phony voice. And I just remember thinking, if only an adult would treat me like I had half a brain in my head, I would tell them everything. And that's what we try to do with book club. We use the book as sort of a jumping off point. And then the conversation just flows. And the conversation is, I always like to say, it's like an adult book club, but without the alcohol.
I think this is great. I think that, and we're going to talk a little bit about why book clubs are so important, because, so many of us are returning to our schools virtually, which means our contact with our students is going to be through Zoom and through Google Meet. And, we have to be incredibly selective in the time we have with our students, because their ability to stay focused via screen is really considerably limited when you are going virtually. So why is hosting a book club during this time of distance learning so particularly important, do you think?
Well, I think we're all hungry for human connection, and I think kids feel that even stronger. They miss that teacher and their classmates and, just being able to hang out. And so much of what's being done with online teaching it's got to be compact. They've got to get all that information in. So the other side of those conversations, the funny things that happen, when the guy in the back corner does something goofy and everybody laughs at it and it sort of becomes a meme for the school, you're going to miss out on that. So for me, I would think that book clubs, it's a different way to connect. You're seeing those faces. You're not given an assignment other than to finish the darn book. There's no grading. You don't have to write a report. There's none of that stuff. It's just sitting around and talking to people. And again, you're using that book, I hope, as a jumping off place. And I would say I hate English class questions. I hated when I would go into schools and you could tell that the English teacher was preparing the kids, and you could tell that the teacher's ego was on the line because these kids were answering English class questions about, grammar and style and theme and, using English class topics.
Yeah, syntax.
Rather than talking,
syntax.
Thank you. Tense. And rather than talking about, hey, I love this book because this guy is so funny. And here's why he's funny. And it reminds me of my brother Jerry. And that time that Jerry went out and, dumped the trash can in the middle of the street. Those conversations are the ones you want to have. They're the ones that are going to keep you connected to people. You have something in common. And in this case, it's a book that allows you to use that as something you have in common to talk about your life, to talk about what's going on, and make that connection virtually.
Well, and I will say right now, I don't know if I've ever said this out loud. If I liked to write about what I read, I would have been an English teacher. Writing to me is pained. Writing to me is pained, and it is work, and it's arduous. And if I could go in and talk about a book that I loved, because I love to read, but God Almighty, I hated to write. And so if I could talk about the book and why I loved it so much and the impact it made on me, perhaps I would have become that English teacher. But I was too put off by all the requiring. And I will say, the thing I heard a really cool interview with a kid talking about how they felt about virtual learning. And they said, I don't have any time to make friends. I'm in this new class because my own school hasn't started yet. And they said, I don't have time to make friends because all we do is teach and learn, teach and learn, teach and learn. And then we turn the screen off to go have lunch, or we turn the screen off because that's our break. And I never get to make any friends. And this was just a kid who was like 5 days into their first week of virtual learning. And it made me think that a book club, a virtual book club, is an opportunity for kids in smaller groups in their grade level, usually in their grade level or, group of friends, to learn more about one another in a way that does not require, as we said, writing an exposition, writing a paragraph about this page, or giving a summary about this, character development. But it's a way for our students to learn more about who's in their book club. And we've talked as librarians, we talk about social emotional learning and talking about how important it is to recognize how the student is doing in their current learning situations and how they, and I'm not describing it very well, and Martha Brungerno is rolling her eyes right now, but, when we are encouraged so much by our administrators to encourage like social emotional learning into our programming, I have to imagine that book clubs would fit the bill. A virtual book club would address many of the things because you're talking about building those connections with those students.
Yep.
Well, and, I think that working through the pandemic has created some unique challenges. And you and I are going to talk about a few of those because as podcasters, we are always adapting what we're doing to these external forces. But when school librarians want to run a book club, albeit virtually, being removed from our library spaces and our collections, it's very unfamiliar, and it's actually unsettling that we are removed from the space where we are happiest. What do you say to those of us who are trying to do this in a way that is so incredibly unfamiliar?
Well, I would say two things. In one way, it's an advantage because I think at this point in history, we all have used Zoom, which is the easiest way to actually host a book club with kids. Books, even though you don't have them in person, you certainly have access to resources to help find the books you want that are available online for free. A lot of libraries, public libraries, will allow you to apply for a library card, even if you don't live in the area right now. And for example, I get audiobooks and I get ebooks from the LA Public Library, LA County Public Library, Redondo Beach Public Library, DC Public Library, and Santa Monica Public Library. So if I can't find it at one, I can find it at another. There's a lot of virtual resources you have. It doesn't cost any money. You just have to find, I would say, at least 3 kids, no more than 6 kids. More than that, it's going to drive you crazy. And not make it too long, And here's one tip. Let the kids pick a book. And I'll tell you, I can always tell when we're doing a book club taping who picked the book. You can always tell. And a lot of them are good for you books, books about, refugees or people with learning disabilities or, serious problem books. Just they're beautifully written. But man, they ain't fun.
And doesn't explain. You don't have a SpongeBob book on I've yet to hear you do a Tracy West Pokemon or
Yep.
I challenge you. The Captain Underpants is somehow must be buried on your website that I've not seen a Captain Underpants.
You can actually see it on the Books We Love page because we do 2 kinds of podcasts. We do one, which is basically this conversation that we talked about. But I only let kids 5th grade to about 8th grade on the show to participate in that because I found that kids younger than 5th grade can only talk plot. And after about 3 minutes of that, I just want to shoot myself. So I want to have a rich conversation. And kids in 5th grade really have a sense of not just the book, but also their place in the world and their really strong opinions about things. And so I want, that's the kind of conversation I want. But for example, Captain Underpants is younger than 5th grade. We also do a segment called What's Your Favorite Book? And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that because you just sit down and talk to a book for about a minute. You talk to a kid about what's your favorite book and why do you love it. And they have, again, trying to get them to talk about something besides plot is always a stretch.
Kitty, I'm glad you mentioned that now because I want teachers to know about the open invitation you have extended to listeners to contribute and be on your podcast. So,
you bet.
And to be fair, that was an option that was available before COVID because that's how my students got on your podcast.
Your kids were great. They were so great.
Well, this invitation, if you friends, when you go on the website, bookclubforkids.org, .org, yes? .org.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So bookclubforkids.org. And you spell it out step by step, but would you walk us through the process for kids to send in contributions of their own? Because you're right. I mean, one of the solutions to book access is to encourage kids to talk about the books they love that they have in their possession, that these are the books that they have already. So how can our listeners share this with our students and be on your podcast?
It's so easy. I mean, all you really need is a smartphone and a kid who's read a book. And you can do this with your students. You can have your parents do it with their kids. Little older kids have their own smart devices. And basically, you open an audio file and you tell us your first name, either the school where you go to school or the city where you live, the name of your favorite book, and why you love it. And, that's about a minute of tape, and you just email it to us, kitty@bookclubforkids.org, and I collect those. And we've done this, I used to do this in person. I'd go on vacation, and I'd bring out my phone, and I'd talk to kids with funny accents, because it's always great to have kids with funny accents, telling us the name of their favorite books. And I would get, book suggestions from Scotland, for heaven's sakes. Not often I would think about looking for Scottish books, but there you go. So that's the invitation, please, if you have kids who would like this experience, and it's a great resume builder, even for grammar school kids, to be on a podcast. It's free. And if a teacher or a librarian will organize this and send me a collection of 4 or more kids from their school, we will brand an episode as from, Watkins Elementary School in Washington, D.C. or something like that. Wherever you go to school, you will have your own episode. You can also send pictures of the kids. Usually we do it with the kids holding a book up under their nose, so there's privacy issues are taken care of. We have permission slips. If you're sending us stuff, quote unquote, unsolicited, we don't worry about the permission slip, but you can certainly do it with your school, however you want to handle it. So that's the easiest way to get your kids on the show ASAP.
Well, and friends, I did this. It was a lot of fun, and it's a little tricky because I teach a fixed schedule, which means I'm usually always teaching. But I went to my 5th grade teachers. I handed each of them like 4 permission slips. And on one side, it was the permission slip that you can print from the website. And on the other side, it was I just had a little open, fill in the blanks. It just said, hi, my name is blank. And the book I love is blank by, and the reason why I love this book is, and the kids, I gave that to the teachers, and the teachers then made the decisions which kids could submit after the kids had brought back their permission slips, and they sent them up to me. It took about 10 minutes. You'd be surprised. Your little chatty Cathys who can't stop talking during library just get nervous. It's really, it's kind of funny actually, because I brought them a mic and I put the little headphones on them, and I said, okay, I want you to read into this mic. And I would literally do it for them. And it took 3, 4, 5 tries because they got so nervous.
Well, and I think this is why a phone is actually a little less scary. When I go out and tape with kids with my microphone, it takes a few minutes for them to forget the mic is there. We just all ignore it. But everybody talks into their phone all the time. So it's pretty, you might get over that problem just by using the mic in your smartphone. There is one other way you can be on the show. And right now we're sort of in beta, I guess is the best way to describe it, because there are so many new technologies showing up for remote taping. As a radio veteran, I hate bad quality audio. And so I've been very dissatisfied with the Zoom audio that we've used on one episode. And we have another one that we're doing that we used to do with voice memos. And it was great, except kids were kicking the chairs and there was a leaf blower and a siren and So we're trying a couple of different technologies. All that said, our hope is in the fall, we will be able to tape full-length book club episodes remotely. And if you are interested in doing that, that would involve getting 3 kids, getting them to read a book that by an author that we haven't already talked to, and arranging a taping time. And we'll need a practice time to work on the technology because it's a new technology. But if you're interested, please send me an email to kitty@bookclubforkids.org, and we'll put you on our list.
Well, and I was just kidding about the whole Captain Underpants thing, but friends, I would suggest if this is something that interests you, go to the website and scroll through, and because what you want to do is do a book talk on a book that hasn't already been done yet. I listen to back episodes all the time, and I'll tell you why. It's Most of you who've been listening for a while know I am not a lifelong reader. I was not born with a book in my hands. Getting me to read was not as easy as you might think. And so when I do my reader's advisory, when I do my purchasing, oftentimes I rely on Book Club for Kids as something of a crutch, because I need help with books that I should have read. Or, maybe when I was first in education, I was a high school teacher. I wasn't reading books that are in my collection that I have right now. And so this has been a way for me to cheat in a way and learn more about the collection that's in front of me and more about the books I want to buy for my students. And listening to your students talk about how much they love the books makes it so easy for me to then talk up the books to my students. And I wanted to sort of bring this back to this idea that you have students talking about, these are middle grade students talking about how much they love these books. And friends, I think as school librarians, we can all agree that the best advertising for a book is another kid who's read it. Our students are walking billboards when they walk down the halls, when they walk in the libraries, and obviously we don't have that right now, but when students talk about how much they love books, they could be saying the same exact thing I do, but the fact that it's coming from a peer, our students, that kind of ringing endorsement from a peer resonates in a way that it never would coming from somebody like me, because I don't count. I'm a grown-up. I do want to remind our listeners as well that one of the advantages we oftentimes have is that in working with our students year after year after year, we build a relationship which, when you consider how we are starting the school year, our classroom teachers have not met their students unless unless they've taught a blended class like a 4-5 or a 3-4. They have not worked with these students yet. When we host a book club like you would, for the most part, unless this is our brand new, first day walking into our schools, we know these students. We've worked with these students. There are some students I've known since they were 5. They're graduating and going off to middle school, and I've worked with these kids for 6 years.
Wow. And
so that kind of relationship building really comes into play when you then create a virtual book club. Kitty, let's talk about many of the episodes that you put together are virtual. You're sitting across the country from your participants. What kind of, suggestions can you give to somebody who's never hosted a book club before virtually?
Well, I'm going to come back to what I said before. Let the kids in on the decision making, even if you offer them a choice of 3 books, the short synopsis or whatever. Because I found that the enthusiasm level oftentimes is a whole lot higher when it's a book that the kids have chosen. And it may be a book that I would never read in my life. They're usually the fantasy versions of the books that the kids pick out. And then when you're having the conversation, you need a little bit of structure, but you need a lot of flexibility. So I would say, when we tape these, I do not go longer than the taping wise 40 minutes. They're exhausted after 30 minutes. So I would keep it, to 20 to 30 minutes. Keep it short. And I would say my parameters would be you start with the book. What's it about? Who's in it? And then you can come up with a couple of what I call pocket questions, which is if the conversation doesn't pick up from there, you can do follow up on which character are you the most like. Or let me give you a couple of examples. To me, it's always surprising in the conversation. If you're listening hard, something will come up. And I always call it the left turn. It's an unexpected topic that seems to sneak in there. So, for example, we did A Tree Grows in Brooklyn with 7th graders. And suddenly in the middle of it, there's one small scene in that book, which if you'll remember, I can't remember if it's a flasher scene or a threatening mail to our heroine. And that prompted this whole Me Too conversation with these girls, because that's what they took away from that book. That's not what I took away from the book, but that was the thing that they wanted to talk about. And you're going to hear this left turn in the conversation with these kids, and you just kind of want to follow it the way it goes and follow up on it. So let me give you another example. When we talked about at the end of the show, we always ask everybody their favorite book, and all these girls were naming dystopian novels. And I said, well, what's the deal? Why are you guys so into dystopian novels? And they said, but because they're hopeful. I was like, wait a minute, this is about the end of the world stuff. Why do you think they're hopeful? They go, well, because it's a girl who's the protagonist and all the boys treat her with respect. And I thought, oh, as opposed to the boys you go to school with. Okay. So,
wow. Well, yeah. I just listened to the episode you did on Rita Williams Garcia's book, One Crazy Summer. Yeah. And you tied it into Black Lives Matter because it dealt with the Black Panthers in the 70s in Oakland, California. And, you know, it was really interesting because even with the students you were dealing with, as young as they were still able to make those connections and really apply it to themselves in such a way that it wasn't intimidating. It didn't feel forced. They volunteered this information. And, you know, I listened to that. I didn't realize it's actually a trilogy. The Rita Garcia Williams. And by the way, read them in order if you can, because I didn't. But I listened to all of them and they're amazing. And it's such a great story about siblings, specifically sisters, growing up and this relationship with this mother of theirs. And, you know, I love how you worked in things that are happening in our world today, but not in a way that sounded like you were trying to teach them something. You know, it was more like I'm having a conversation with you.
Well, and I'm actually curious because these are kids who couldn't imagine, you know, the 70s may as well have been the 1800s as far as they were concerned. So what's inside their heads? You know, what do they think? How do they relate it to what's going on in their neighborhood or in their house? That's what I want to know. I want to know, you know, I want a peek into their lives. That's, you know, what I want to know. Because I remember, like I said, I remember this age group so clearly. And it was a time of exploration and discovery. And if only people would treat me seriously. And I really think if you treat kids seriously, they will tell you amazing things, really amazing things.
Well, and I want to go back to this idea of facilitating friendship making, because using podcasts to help your students get to know one another better as classmates, because I felt after listening to your episode, I knew more about these kids and what they were willing to share about growing up in their relationship with their siblings. And I have to imagine that if you were in the book club as a student, you would learn more about your peers because you had this shared reading experience. I love that.
And let me just add one that this is what can happen. We did Kwame Alexander's book, The Crossover, and it's about brothers in basketball, and it's written in prose. And so in the conversation, we talked about poetry, which you say you're not a reader. I'm not a poetry lover, and the kids love making fun of me for that. But as we started talking about the brothers part and sibling relationships, I have to tell you, when I walked into the school library, there were 5 fifth grade boys, and they were literally climbing the walls of a bookcase, literally. And the school librarian had to go in there and pluck them off the wall and sit them down on the beanbag. And I thought, this is not going to go well at all. But when we got to the part about the brothers, they started talking about their own lives. And one of the boys said, I hated my older sister. I hated her. And I could hardly wait for her to go to college. And then when she went, I felt sad. And I don't know why. And then the other boys started chiming in and talking about his father who worked at Amtrak. And he always got concerned because his dad had to climb on a ladder to change the light bulbs and then he did his dad's voice. You could just hear this, because nobody else knows what they're really doing here. And this went on and on and on. And then these guys, 5 little boys, broke into an a cappella song that they wrote inspired by this book. I mean, all you had to do was just sit there and listen to them. You know what I mean? That's the power of books, to be able to open kids up, to talk about this emotional, learning, what's going on inside of their heads and their hearts.
Well, and when you consider how right now, trying to build these relationships virtually.
Yeah.
To be able to make those connections with a small group with our students, it really does invite these opportunities, which I think when we're trying to teach classrooms, it can be, I think a lot of times kids who want to disappear into the background can easily do that in these virtual settings. And if you bring together a small group of students, I'm not saying you can't hide, but I'm saying you have less of a reason to want to hide,
And also it's easy to see who's not talking and say, and Jill, what did you think about what Harold just said?
Yeah. I think that kids are less intimidated by the screen than I think some adults are.
Than we are, yeah.
I think some people find the screen far more intimidating the older we get. I've been telling school librarians about the value of your podcast. It's been helping me do my job. And I mentioned it in an episode in February of 2019 titled Podcasts and You. And I have to imagine that school librarians were not your intended audience when you conceived of this Book Club for Kids podcast.
Well, I have to say that they may not have been my first thought, but they certainly were my second thought. Because I'm not marketing to kids, quite frankly. And when I started, this is how far we have come as far as the podcast world goes. When I first started this, I'd go into the classroom and I'd ask the kids if they knew what a podcast was. And almost all of them said no. And then I had to teach them how to download a podcast. Well, now when I go into a classroom, how many kids know what a podcast is? Just about all the hands go. Most of them listen to it. I ask them, what do they listen to? And I said, are your parents listening? They said, not really. So I make the kids as an assignment teach their parents how to download a podcast, which is great because it makes them feel empowered. And hey, I get a new listener.
Well, and this is a good opportunity to mention how, especially if we're looking for activities that are appropriate and safe and, advertisement free, putting our kids in front of YouTube does not satisfy those requirements. And the fact of the matter is that you have your students, whether you're a classroom teacher, a grade level teacher, or you're a school librarian, and you suggest, hey, we should listen to this podcast, or friends, I'm going to put this podcast. I think you should try listening to this on your smartphone. And I'll actually go through screencast my phone onto my smartboard to show my students, or I'll show them on my desktop just to show them how to get to a podcast. And, I have to imagine that as the longer we are virtual, the more likely receptive parents are going to be to having them listen to your show, to, other ones that are geared more towards our student audience. And I really think that school librarians, when we realize what your podcast has to offer, might invite this opportunity for their readers as well.
And I do want to put in a plug, Amy, for the world of podcasts for kids has exploded as well. And there's some really good ones out there, having to do with science or history or ethics. And if you go to kidslisten.org, we'll have that on the show notes, I assume. There are a list of about 100 podcasts specifically designed for kids. Different ages, though. Some of them are for really little kids, and some of them are for more the tween area, which is where I am operating.
Well, but the difference is, what I really love about your podcast is it encourages kids to read more. Because my own reading list only gets longer. I'll listen to the episode.
Sorry about that.
No, it's great. I actually find that I'm listening to a lot of them. So I can find these audiobooks on Hoopla and on Sora. And and Libro FM, friends, I'll put a link in the show notes. But Libro FM is giving free audiobooks to school librarians, and these are new releases, and it's fantastic. But it is one of the ways we can do better about reading the books that our students want to read. But when the kids listen to your podcast, it's not like that's a substitution for reading the book. Now you've whet their appetite. They are excited to read it, and again, it has been a conversation with their peers. And that legitimates this experience now. Now they want to read the book because these kids, albeit kids they don't know, but kids their age, speaking about how important this book was to them. I especially think that's the case when you have these shorter episodes where you talk about my favorite book. Why is it your favorite book? And I really think it's fantastic. I want to focus on your website before you go, because your website is a resource, and school librarians are all about resources. And, you focus on middle grade literature, which really the lovely thing about that is your upper elementary kids are going to be reading those books. Yeah. Your high schoolers who are now, just leaving middle grade and they're going into high school are still reading these titles. So you do sort of, across a wide spread of ages here. But, you include the curriculum guides, and you said you're going to be adding to more of those. Yep. You have, and this was fantastic, 31 interviews with writers on writing. And, the more I know about an author, the better I am at encouraging these readers to read these books. But can you speak a little bit to your episodes that focus exclusively on the writing and the writing process? Because I'm thinking this would be an ELA dream to come into this. You're an English teacher and you want to talk about different writing styles, and you've got these interviews with these authors. You're so lucky.
Oh, I'm very lucky. And I have to confess, Amy, it was a purely selfish reason that this whole thing started. Usually I have questions from the kids that I will pose to the authors, but I've still got the authors in front of me after I've run out of the 5 or 6 questions the kids have. So I get to ask questions. And because when I started the podcast, I was seriously trying to get up the nerve to write a book. And, I'd written plays, but I had never written a book. And so I really kind of wanted to have really professional advice from these people. But because we tried to keep our episodes to 20 minutes, the full-length episodes, I had extra tape, as we used to say in radio. So I would repurpose it. And, I didn't want to waste it. I didn't want to waste any of these great things that these authors had to say. And so we started collecting them. And we're, again, continuing to add to that list. And they're short. And it's sort of a supplement to what they already say in the episode. So if you want to hear more from the author, they're also in the episode, specifically usually talking about that book. But writers love to talk about writing, and I just find it fascinating. Like when Peter Brown, who wrote The Wild Robot, and he's an illustrator as well as a writer, and he talked about, mapping, almost like it was a crime map from some detective novel where they have the big white paper on the board and they're drawing lines everywhere. That's how he writes his plots. And I thought, wow, I've never even thought about that.
Not on the back of a napkin? You mean that's where all bestsellers come from, is the back of a napkin or a coaster. So friends, I love that opportunity that you focus on, and it's easy for you to search because you just drop down on the tab, Writers on Writing. We talked a minute earlier about tips for creating lifelong readers, and I think that we are kidding ourselves, school librarians, if we think we've cornered the market on how to inspire students to read more. I will say I fail miserably sometimes, and we've all struck out. We have our students, and they're right in front of us, and try as we may, trying to match that the kid with the book. I'm going to strike out, and I found it so great. You've got these tips for creating lifelong readers, and you've invited us to send in some. But I really love what other people say, and I love that you put these here where we can read them and access them, because I'm not the expert on inspiring readers.
Neither am I.
I get ideas. I was reading these and I was thinking, wow, that's a really good strategy. And we're going to need all the help we can get, especially because we're doing this remotely. So it's great. And we talked about the newsletter, and I wanted to ask you, you had an opportunity to do a TEDx conversation. And I love listening to it. And friends, I'll include a link in the show notes. You've been collaborating with librarians for years.
Well, the podcast I've been doing since 2015. But like I said, my first job was working at what used to be called the East Compton branch of the LA County Public Library. And when I was doing my talk show, we actually did a remote from my old library. It was a building that was probably built in the 40s, and it was great just to be there. So I've maintained relationships with librarians over the years. And we even got to broadcast from the brand new East Rancho Dominguez Library in Compton. It was a beautiful new building. So they're nice people. Librarians are my people.
Yeah, we try to be. We certainly try. miss this opportunity to ask you about your book. And this isn't, the Book Club for Kids isn't your only podcast. So tell us, you sent me a copy, and that was fantastic. Nobody sends me ARCs. No, I don't get any books. I'm sorry. Publishers, if you'd like to send me something free, I'd really appreciate it. But, tell us about your book. And because I think that's fun because it has this podcasting component to it.
Yeah. So like I said, I had always wanted to write fiction, but, I would write plays and I would write radio stories, which I discovered is a different world than writing fiction. So it took me a long time to really kind of focus. But because I had covered Washington, D.C., and it was such a culture clash for me, a California girl going there. And just even weird things like I noticed that people in Washington on Capitol Hill have the ugliest shoes in America. I mean, truly, really ugly shoes. Like the standard was kind of round-toed ballerina flats with a buckle across the top. Like, who thought that was attractive? And I started taking pictures of them and posting them on Twitter as shoes on the hill because they were just some really amazing. There's a picture of Barbara Boxer's shoes in there. It's just some really ugly shoes that were in Washington. And I would tell these stories about things like that to my friends back in California. And then I sort of ran out of people to tell these stories to. So that was I wanted to find a way to explain my experience of being on Capitol Hill, which I loved. I loved the U.S. Capitol. It's the most beautiful building in America. And I loved being in there and having access and all that kind of stuff. And I wanted to share that joy. So that's where it started. And years ago, I had mentored this kid who is now a teacher and working on her PhD. Her name was Fina. And in my mind, even though I hadn't known her when she was 10, that's who this character was. And she just sort of took over the story. And so it's the story of the 10-year-old daughter of a congressman from Los Angeles who moves to Washington, D.C. and solves the mystery of the demon cat of Capitol Hill, which is a real thing on Capitol Hill. It's a real Halloween story they always tell. So I got to sneak in all this stuff about how Congress works or doesn't work, all the weird stories I had about ugly shoes and things like that. And so the book came out in February of last year. Welcome to Washington, Fina Mendoza. And, did the book festivals and things like that. And then I thought, I want to stay with this character. How can I do this? And because I knew how to do a podcast, I thought, let's just do it as a podcast. So I rewrote the book as an audio drama, and I didn't want to do it in a studio. I wanted to do it like I did a public radio story. I wanted to take it outside and find locales that sounded exactly like the places in the book. So we actually did tape in a real public library without getting caught. We didn't ask permission. We just went in and did a guerrilla. We did it at the LA Zoo. It wasn't the National Zoo, but it was a zoo. We taped at a jazz concert where I live. We used to have summer concerts here, and they let me take over the stage and use their microphone with its really bad, megaphone kind of bounce back quality for the last scene in the book. And we taped in our clubhouse, which has hard surfaces that sound like the U.S. Capitol and the crypt. So it was really, really, really a fun experience. And so that is called the Fina Mendoza Mysteries. And we even did a coronavirus episode that has some curriculum to go with it. And I'm working on book 2. I finished book 2, and we're going to have a second season of Fina someday.
Wow. I think that creating that listening opportunity to go along with the book is really fun because, when you have that sort of immersive experience listening to the book, it really does, it really does tap a different experience for, or at least me as an audiobook fan. And I think it's really fun because you really just sort of like the icing on the cake. You've got the book, you've got the podcast. Kitty, before I let you go, you have a fantastic addition to your website, which I want to see. This is really a cool thing that we could do with our collections, obviously when we're working with our collections, but you have corresponding QR codes to your episodes, which anyone can use a QR reader, and it would then directly take the user to the episode. And so what we can do is take those QR codes and tape them to like the inside cover of the book that matches the episode.
And I have to tell you, Amy, this was a suggestion from a school librarian, which I just thought was brilliant. So please, if anybody else has any brilliant ideas, don't hesitate to send them to me.
Well, and we are lifelong learners. And so, we are very excited about incorporating things that are new and different into our programs. And but friends, what an interesting addition to a book to have a QR code and students could simply scan it, and, our older students with their smartphones, and then they could listen to the conversation at either before or after they're reading the story. And it really does, it invites them to reflect on this book that's in their hands without having to look for the episode.
Yeah.
I love that. I think that's so fantastic. Now I want to be back in my library, print up the QRs, and I'm going to tape them inside my
someday.
books. Yeah.
Someday soon, we hope. We hope.
Friends, I think you will recognize many of the titles that you have in your collection you'll find on the website, and you can download the QR. So, friends, we are incredibly fortunate that Kitty Felde, the Kitty Felde, host of Book Club for Kids, could join us today because she has been hosting virtual book clubs for 5 years now and has quite a following. And I'm so excited to see some of these strategies used, and hopefully they'll help you when you host your virtual book clubs with your students. So, friends, I do want to say goodbye to Kitty. I'm going to be putting all of her social media contacts into our show notes. I encourage you to look at the show notes because you'll be able to visit Kitty's resources on her webpage. Kitty, thank you so much for coming today.
Oh, Amy, I cannot tell you how excited I was when you said you wanted me on the show. So thank you very much for inviting me.
I am so grateful that Kitty was able to take some time out of her own busy podcasting schedule and could share with us her strategies and resources for hosting virtual book clubs with our students. I strongly encourage you to get lost in her website because bookclubforkids.org is a fantastic place to go, full of great resources, whether you use them for your book clubs and your resources as a school librarian, or you share those out with your grade level teachers. If you found this episode helpful, please share it out with your team, your PLN, and on social media. The topic of our next episode will be soft censorship, and my interview with Nancy Jo Lambert. I hope you will tune in.